Welcome back to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we are going to continue with part 2 of Ben and Tony's discussion on reconceptualizing war. Enjoy.
And this idea of a critical eye, a reflective practitioner, anyone that's maybe coming up or has seen what's happened in the last, let's say, 20, 25 years, and they might be a little bit younger to suit this question, but they certainly see a strong effort in terms of counterinsurgency, what is lacking, the lessons learned, and then a very strong conventional war with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And one does wonder how a culture in a military can be flexible enough to understand what's needed for these different settings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two biggest conflicts right now, the hot wars, are the Ukrainian-Russian war and then the Israeli-Hamas war. And I address both of those, both in the abstract and with the Israeli-Hamas war, because Hamas is, as I define it using Rappaport's constructs, a divine, messianic, eschatological organization or a doomsday cult. They believe they're bringing about radical transformation of all reality as we know it through a divine or ideological construct. Messianic means that the people that are going to bring in this new world, this Armageddon, are here on the ground, able to do it. Eschatological is the fancy word for end of world, end of days. And this is important because eschatological war theory is also tied into Marxism. Even though it's not the end of the world, it's transforming humanity from a capitalist oppressive system into a post-capitalist communist utopia. So these are both eschatological, but they're different in that what the Hamas is doing is not, they're not socialists, they're not Marxist, right? There's something different. And I go into these details in my 6th chapter where I talk about radical omnism or these extreme groups. It's certainly not limited to Islamic terror groups. This is everywhere. And so I use Christian Branch Davidians. I go into the Japanese extremist Buddhist group that did the subway sarin gas attacks. Although there are quite a bit of Islamic radical terror organizations that are quite easy to pull from, Hamas being one of them. And those aren't the same as when we look at, say, contemporarily, if we look at Egypt or if we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, that's morphed into a relatively mainstream Westphalian construct, even though it has a Sharia law elements to it. It's still looking at a nation state governing and organizing and regulating a population in perpetuity within a system of states. So that's more functionalist. All of these things are tied in. So if you look at the Ukrainian conflict, you've got what Russia is doing. Yes, they're an oligarchy, but they are still operating within the Westphalian nation-state construct, not like the Soviet Union, which I talk about in chapter 5 and 6, where they're operating under a communist construct, which is very close to what China is doing today, although China must be considered not as a clone or a surrogate or an equivalent to something like the Soviet Union. In the book, I go into great detail about the origins of Eastern philosophy and how Taoism and Confucianism underpin Chinese society in a way that's quite different from Western constructs, Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman. And then on top of that is where Mao applied a Sino-Marxist modification, deviating even from Lenin, on how to bring about the Chinese Revolution. And those things formulate what their paradigm is today, still in the radical structuralist paradigm, chapters 5 and 6, which is very different from Western, the functionalist paradigm. And that conflict of the Ukraine and Russia would generally fit within a functionalist paradigm. It's two functionalist nations fighting each other. Hamas and Israel, that's different. That's Israel being a Western, a functionalist society, operating and fighting against a radical omnist. I have an extension of radical structuralism where Burrell and Morgan kind of limited it there. But in order to bring in Rappaport, extend into radical omnism to incorporate these groups that are not Marxist, but swimming in Marxist waters that share either ontological or epistemological association with the radical structuralist construct that I set up. I know that was a lot of fancy words in there, but for our listeners, essentially we can't treat the Israeli-Hamas conflict the same that we do Ukraine and Russia, because the Hamas mindset, their war paradigm, is profoundly different than all those other state actors. It's profoundly different, and it has to be understood in that sense. And this is above strategy, because strategy is subservient to your paradigm. This is at that philosophical and sociological and cultural level.
I wonder, if we think back to, was it Bill Clinton, that got pretty far with brokering a deal. And I think at the end, Yasser Arafat just couldn't do it. And I can't remember if it was in a report or in a documentary that I saw it. And, one of the advisors just said they had seen Yasser Arafat in Palestine and whatever's happening, and he's in this dim lit room and he has his kind of pistol on the desk and he's doing whatever he's doing there. And eventually this person says, with that in mind, and just, as a case in point or as a glimpse, there was never going to be a peace because we just didn't understand what was happening, in that specific context where their paradigm or frame of reference, it was just removed from what they were trying to achieve, right? It's almost like the peace negotiation, like we didn't understand what is being traded and offered.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a beautiful example of where a lack of understanding different war paradigms leads to inappropriate strategic conclusions, worthless attempts at foreign policy, or misguided ones. The purpose of Reconceptualizing War in my book is to kind of set up a different framework. And that's where I lead the readers to the 8th chapter where I talk about interpretivism. And that paradigm, Burrell and Morgan argue or suggest that of all the paradigms, and this work mostly developed in the 1980s and 90s after their initial 10-year run on developing the foundations of social paradigm theory, which started saying that if you're in one paradigm, you're probably not going to acknowledge or get along with any of the others. You can't really cross in. But in the 1990s in particular, a lot of sociologists started saying, well, we think there's multi-paradigmic ways of doing things. Not that you're hovering above. If you're a human being living biologically set within a linear time-space construct, right? If you're a human being, you have to be in a social paradigm. You can't rise above. But what you can do through interpretivism, arguably, and I try to set this case in motion in my book, is you can start to explore and engage with other paradigms, essentially keeping one foot in interpretivism, but then bouncing your other foot into different war paradigms. And the advantage there would be that foreign policy approaches with the Russia-Ukrainian one is not really a great example because you're dealing with two, even though Russia and Ukraine are different, they're still largely operating in the same paradigm, functionalism, which is a very big paradigm, right? There's lots of space for functionalists to go to war against each other. However, the Hamas-Israeli conflict and the budding Cold War, if you will, between the West, the United States in particular, and China, these are not the same paradigms. This would be with Israel and Hamas, this is radical omnism versus functionalism. And then with China, this is radical structuralism, the Chinese, Sino-Marxism versus dominant functionalist paradigm here in the West. And foreign policy decisions, strategy, all of these large national level and military instrument of power decision-making should operate first from a departure of a multi-paradigmic approach. Because even if we still use our own paradigm, and we say, we know Clausewitz is still right, at least acknowledging that the other opponent, the adversary, isn't using it and looks at it totally differently can inform decision makers and leaders. That's my argument. We've got to think bigger. We've got to think more flexibly, more plastically, and we have to be able to creatively and cunningly out-cognate adversaries.
So I'm going to throw this, not a curveball, but it's a random one. Some of the things that you've mentioned, Ben, it's simple in principle and they are super complex, right? The depth of it, it's pretty immense. So if we bring it back to some of the people who perhaps, that we've referred to, that you've referred to, if you could go back in time and perhaps debate or discuss war theory with any of these great names, maybe over a coffee or something a bit stronger, which historical figure would that be?
Wow, that's a fun question. I've never been asked that question. So kudos to you, Tony, for pulling something really out of the box. Of all the theorists I studied, I think I'd be most interested in Sun Tzu. And part of it is because it's so far back that there's lots of questions over what he wrote, whether he was actually one or multiple people. It's so difficult to go that far back and get a firm understanding of how much of this was his own original thinking, how much has been modified over the centuries in translation, how much has a scribe inserted what they thought and modded it. We've seen that just with Clausewitz. So Clausewitz died in 1831. His book was posthumously published by his wife and editor in 1832. And then it had this very slow buildup where it really wasn't read by anyone, not even the Germans. And even the Germans going into World War I, they did adapt it quite a bit. But in the 1870s, it was more of a fantasy. It's more of a legend that they were just studying Clausewitz. And in reality, it was they weren't. They were mostly reading Jomini because even the Germans didn't really understand the Prussians' German romanticism and some of his blending of the subjective and objective and all this philosophical mumbo-jumbo. They liked Jomini. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that, right? So even in more recent impressive military theorists that we have, we see distortion, we see misinterpretation, we see people arguing, well, and how many times have you seen an article in the last couple of decades? Here's what Clausewitz really meant. Or if Clausewitz were alive today, he would be a chaostician. Or Clausewitz anticipated quantum warfare, right? There's just ridiculous arguments that are being thrown out there. Clausewitz was the first complexity scientist. I've heard that recently, which is preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous. Now, did Clausewitz have a understanding of complexity set within mainstream philosophical understanding of complex, relevant to a Newtonian framework of European thinking at the time in the 19th century? Absolutely. Absolutely. Was he the first complexity scientist of war? Now you're stretching it. Now you're starting it. Well, maybe he was the first AI scientist too, right? It starts getting crazy. But when you see those arguments, what's really happening, Tony, is there's new things entering into our current frame. AI is a great example. And these things are challenging us. And it's challenging our frame. And so the frame, the paradigm, in order for it to remain relevant and dominant and sustain itself to the next generation, the defenders and the built-in defense systems that protect the ontology and epistemology will start pushing certain advocates to find ways to assimilate artificial intelligence into a Clausewitzian construct. And what's really doing is saying, Clausewitz subscribes to the functionalist paradigm, following this ontology and epistemology, differing in ways from, say, Jomini, differing from Vauban, certainly, differing from Fuller, but still in the same paradigm. And so if we're going to interpret AI in a functionalist construct, we have to suck it in so that it works and underpins the belief system that sustains the entire war paradigm. Whereas if you have AI interpreted differently, say through a Marxist lens, they're going to be doing the same thing because they're trying to keep the Marxist constructs sustainable. So we have a lot of people arguing about, say, artificial intelligence in war, but they're largely doing it through different social paradigms, which makes each other distort or become incommensurate. They're shouting past each other and not listening.
Support the mission, one beer at a time. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and we'll raise a glass in your honor. Now, let's get back to it.
That's a good answer. I really enjoyed that. It really does show the whole thing open when you think about going back in time, understanding the norms of that time, right? And, a lot of your philosophical exposition is about those paradigms. And some of them, as you've mentioned, change over time. Some of them remain when we think about the East, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and so on. And I'm kind of at the point, where I wonder, you had mentioned earlier, if you could advise someone for the future leaders that they understand that. I really wonder now more than ever if people are in fact reading some of these older theorists, let alone the depth that you've gone to, Ben, but just, in terms of the broad understanding of conflict, whether it's Machiavelli, whether it's, some of more stuff from antiquity. But it remains a question mark for me.
For me, it would be unrealistic for us to take on something this big initially when you're starting out. When I think back to, I joined the Army when I was 18 years old, and I was an E1 private in the infantry. And I joined to pay for college because I had no other options. And so like a lot of impoverished or poverty-stricken citizens, you use military service as a way to getting yourself up and out of your condition. And you know what? You look back at Clausewitz and others and Scharnhorst, and they were kind of doing the same thing in different ways. But there's this struggle of being And some of it's class-based, of course, especially when you go back to the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, because you've got a whole societal transformation going on. But for me personally, if I think back to when I was a young private, I was the contrarian. I got myself in trouble with my drill sergeants. At the same time, I was clever. I think they saw that, so they would poke me a bit, pick on me, but at the same time, they kind of enjoyed it. Like, oh, okay, this is a clever little private. Let's see what he's going to do. And then as a lieutenant, I also got that same type of carrot and stick. But it wasn't until I was maybe a senior captain where I really started challenging myself on, all right, why does doctrine say it this way? And what's beyond doctrine? What's underneath it? What's underpinning it? And for me, as a major, as a field grade officer, I had an incredible opportunity to go to an advanced military school program. In the Army, it's called SAMS, School of Advanced Military Studies. There's a bunch of these around the world, and your industrialized, more advanced societies are able to run them themselves, and then otherwise a lot of nations will just send their best and brightest to these programs. And in my seminar alone, I had the smartest Pakistani officer, the smartest officer, international officer I'd ever met, and he's Pakistani. And I always say that because my classmate, Sam, who sat next to me, was a Brit. And so I'd always look him directly there. I'd say, Ali is the smartest international officer I've ever met. just to poke my British friend a little bit. We'd laugh about it. But really, the quality of people that go to these programs it's astounding. So I felt pretty lucky. Somebody made a mistake and let me in. And then this was an entire year of learning about the military, but also learning about yourself. And one of the first homework assignments they gave us in the SAMS program, they asked us a couple weeks in, and we'd just done some basic readings, reading this, reading that, kind of scrambling around in the dark. You're trying to feel yourself around. And they say, you need to define your war philosophy and present it to the class. You have 15 minutes or 15 minutes of presentation. And I remember doing that assignment over the weekend, pulling my hair out, going like, I don't know what our war philosophy is. And I ended up doing this really, like looking back at it, this really crappy kind of, I'd take some Clausewitz and Germany, I kind of wrap it around and throw some Boyd in there. And I was like, hey, here it is. And it felt terrible because I felt ignorant. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've been in the military for 12 years and I can't articulate what we do. And so that actually set me in motion. And now 15 years later, this book comes out as kind of a late homework assignment to my SAM seminar. So, wherever my faculty are now, John and Alice, I've got my new assignment here. Please grade it. But what it did was it set me in motion to start reading and writing and experimenting and talking and arguing with anybody I could find. And I felt a little bit like Socrates, wandering around getting myself in trouble in ancient Greece. And I did. I got myself in trouble in the military for challenging things that shouldn't be challenged. But it led me down to this incredible intellectual path where I had to read all these different things and think about it. And then once I had this level of writing and research maturity, I was able to do this book. And that's, I think, where I've been for the last 3 years is, okay, I'm ready, let's write it. And then as I wrote it, it was just hundreds of iterations of chapters and sharing them with friends and colleagues and getting their feedback and modifying it and throwing it out there again and just nonstop engagement with this incredible network, which really, and I talk about them a little bit in the intro, couldn't have done it without them.
What an accomplishment and what a way to say it, a homework assignment. But I'm sure all your professors would be very proud of this manuscript that you've created. Then as we come to the end of this podcast, and it's really been a pleasure. And just for our listeners, as always, we'll add the links into the show notes and we'll add some details about Ben. And if you could give us a sentence or two in terms of how you define success for a strategic thinker. And that might be a harsh or unfair question almost, Ben, but if you could give us a flavor of what that could be.
First, reflective practice. You have to be reflective as you practice. Second, you must be infinitely curious. And third, you have to be courageous to a fault. And what I mean by that is your curiosity is about development, growth, and failure. And as we experiment, it's in our nature to do things that reinforce the paradigm that governs us. It's in our nature to try to be successful in the way that society or the institution says, hey, this is the best way. And all the innovators and outliers all have usually one thing in common. They came up with something new and were told, no, stop, wrong. And so if you are a a reflective practitioner, you realize when you're in that moment. You'll feel it. And if you are curious, you're going to push yourself infinitely towards growing as a human being. And then the bravery, the courage, is about knowing even when everything is pushed against you, if you really believe in what you're doing, and not in an overconfident, arrogant way, but just combining that creativity with the reflective practice, if you're contributing to society, to humanity, that I think is the best thing. And for me, it's like, yes, it's a book on war, reconceptualizing war. So some of my friends that are in more of the anti-military kind of mindsets, how could you write that? Are you trying to make the military better at killing? No, no, I'm not. I'm trying to create societies that can utilize military instruments of power in ways that are more informed and are able to deal with the conflicts that our species perpetually generates, because war apparently isn't going away. But if we can approach war in a more productive way, we could actually save more lives. We could do things that have better resolution for everyone if we're honest. And then if you have to go to war, can you win quickly and effectively and decisively, right?
Ben, thanks for that. And you've hit on a very important point for us. Sometimes we speak to people that aren't exposed to the military, and there's kind of this binary argument, anything to do with war and philosophy, war and society. Everyone takes it as praising war. And I must say, I've recently had someone that I'd met, a mutual friend introduced us, and this person has a podcast and we have underground strategy. And they said, "Oh, what's the topic?" And I said, "We talk about conflict, talk about war." And before I could say anything more, they said, I don't care about that. They don't want to praise war. And I just left. I was like, okay, fine. I said, we're about the stories about war. So I'm very interested in what you said over there, how your book addresses fundamental aspects of how we think about it, not just, how we become killing machines.
Right. And I mentioned this in my book in the introduction as a bit of a warning to readers. And I also talk about it in my interpretivist chapter. And then in the conclusion, I'm fully aware that my book, it tries to reconceptualize war in a way that could be utilized by anybody, anyone that uses a war paradigm, because we all do. War is something that is part of the human condition, in that if we go back to cave paintings, right, they found lots and lots of ancient cave paintings that reflect the pre-civilization, the earliest examples of humanity, right? And they have hunting, they have all sorts of things in there. But you know what they don't have? There's no depictions of war. I use that as part of my argument in the first and second chapter to articulate, using Rappaport, Burrell, Morgan, and myself, to say war is something that became a specialization manifested after the establishment of civilization. And so since we as humans yearn for civilization, and we're always hopefully going to have some form of civilization, we unfortunately have to deal with the fact that with civilization appears to come war. There's no evidence of us having civilization without war. And so then how do we deal with that innate element that's perpetually there in every society, in every example, in every shred of archaeology in terms of civilization? Could my book be used by functionalist Western militaries to more productively approach foreign policy and the application of organized violence with a military instrument of power? Yes. Could Russians use this to advance Putin's oligarchy? Yes, also. Could the Chinese use this to foster a stronger Sino-Marxist regime? Yes, arguably they could. Could social Marxists use this to help advance social revolution around the world, utilizing these constructs from the Frankfurt School, from Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, and others that have been developed in the 20th century? Yes, they could. Could divine, radical, ideological doomsday groups or eco-terrorist groups use this book too? Yes, right? And I don't like some of those answers because I'm a patriot to my country, I'm a military veteran, and I'm a servant of the United States government. But when we're talking about war philosophy and we're talking about learning and growing and developing, everyone's capable of doing that, regardless of what social or war paradigm you utilize. And if you're pursuing goals that are contrary to others, well, that is the basis of conflict, unfortunately. However, I think that Western democracies and free thinkers and individual rights that are found in mostly the West are going to be more favorable to open dialogue and creative experimentation on the concepts in this book than anywhere else. And in fact, if you go into different types of regimes that operate under these different paradigms, it's increasingly harder to have these discussions because these conversations may threaten the ontological and epistemological assumptions that underpin those societies entirely. So this could be a very, very dangerous book in the hands of certain people, say in China or in different parts of the world that operate in such. So I'm interested, but I'm also aware. If we want to reconceptualize war, we are dealing with fire, of course, but it's just a different type of fire than the one we were dealing with up until now. It's not going to take war away. I talk about the elimination of war. I talk about peace movements extensively in this book, and I talk about the ontology of those mindsets as well. But from my perspective right now, only something as radical as the insertion of artificial general intelligence could usher in new, novel developments in social reality, some of which may end up with a peaceful civilization for all of humanity, but others may not. And that's a whole other topic. I do branch on that a bit in chapters 8 and the conclusion, but I also have a lot of other writings out there in journals on artificial intelligence and war. If readers are interested, they just need to Google AI and Ben Zweibelson, and a lot of it will come up.
On that note, then, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, and we'll add all the links to the show notes, and all the very best with your book.
Tony, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, and thanks for this opportunity to have this great conversation. This is really amazing. This is really what makes it worth.
And since we didn't have any takers on closing this podcast properly, I got the honors to do that. I didn't have the time to talk to Ben in this one, but I had the time to read his book while they were having fun recording this. And I can really recommend it. It's a heavy read, but it's well worth it. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week as always. Bye-bye.